Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Joshua Stewart. I'm a first year at the college studying government and economics, and I'm also a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located at the park side and the JFK Street side. In the event of an emergency, walk to an exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Natasha Pereira.
Josh. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Natasha Pereira, and I'm an undergraduate at the college studying economics and English. It is difficult to speak of South Sudan without recognizing both unimaginable suffering and unimaginable resilience. Since gaining independence in 2011, after decades of brutal civil war, the world's newest nation has endured wave after wave of violence, displacement, hunger, and a subsequent civil war. Peace agreements have been signed and broken, hopes have risen and been dashed. Today, over 9 million people, nearly 3/4 of the population that remains, require humanitarian aid to survive. Children are starving not because there isn't enough food in this world, but because politics, power, and neglect have kept it from reaching them. This is not just a humanitarian crisis, this is a crisis of accountability and a crisis of fatigue. It is a crisis that the international community too often chooses to look away from because it's brutal, it is ongoing, and worst of all, in some ways it's expected. Behind these numbers are lives, and we gather here tonight not just to understand the crisis, but to listen to those who have spent decades working on the ground and fighting for peace. Joining us tonight is Alex de Waal, Mai Hassan, David Miliband, Hamid El-Bashir Ibram, and moderator Zoe Marks. Alex de Waal is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation and a professor at the Tufts Fletcher School. Considered one of the foremost experts on Sudan and the Horn of Africa, his scholarly work and practice has also probed humanitarian crisis and response, human rights, HIV and AIDS, and governance in Africa, conflict, and peace building. Mai Hassan is the associate professor of political science at MIT and the faculty director of MIT Africa. Her ongoing research focuses on popular mobilization under autocratic regimes with a focus on Sudan's 2018 to 2019 popular uprising. David Miliband is the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, the leading humanitarian effort in over 40 crisis-affected countries. And as a former UK Foreign Secretary, Miliband brings both personal and professional commitment to global humanitarian issues. He's a prominent advocate of refugee rights and international cooperation in crisis response. And notably, in 2023 alone, the IRC served more than 34.5 million people in countries affected by crisis. Joining us remotely tonight will be Dr. Hashim El-Bashir Ibram, whose professional journey has spanned 4 areas: academia, applied research in the social sector, hands-on experience in developmental practice, and work with NGOs and national government. He has taught courses at the University of Khartoum and has participated in research projects on the Sahel region of Sudan, specifically on issues relating to rural development and conflicts between farmers and pastoralists. And then finally, we have Zoe Marks moderating tonight's forum. Marks is the Oppenheimer Faculty Director for the Center of African Studies at Harvard University and a lecturer in public policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research and teaching interests focus on the intersection of conflict, political violence, race, gender, inequality, peace building, and African politics. Finally, we would like to thank the Carr Ryan Center for Human Rights, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and the Center for African Studies in their support in making tonight's forum event possible. Now, please join me in a warm round of applause to welcome tonight's guests to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Zoe, and we're really fortunate to also be joined remotely by Dr. Hamid Ibrahim, so he'll soon be joining us on the screen as well. I wanted to first start with just a little bit of scene setting, and then we'll jump right into a really rigorous discussion about a really difficult topic. So Today marks the 2-year anniversary, or the start of the 3rd year of Sudan's civil war. It's been described as the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world. And because of the way the world has changed over the past decades and centuries, that makes it the greatest humanitarian crisis in history. There have been 2 Ramadans that have been celebrated under gunfire, bombing, and starvation. And the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, represented Sudanese civil society today at a high-level, invitation-only conference in London, the London Conference on Sudan, which excluded both of the warring parties, but invited many of their patrons and supporters. And former President Mbeki of South Africa said, "This anniversary cannot just be another occasion for wringing hands. We must together seize this moment to prioritize action, courage, and coordination over apathy, drift, and division." The world has failed Sudan, he went on to say, through its paralysis, inaction, and in some cases, complicity in aggravating the violence. Global efforts to respond to the conflict, and I paraphrase, have lacked coherence and they've lacked political clarity. He said they have often been piecemeal, reactive, and duplicative. So tonight's forum actually began as a conversation between myself and Alex, talking about what we can do at Harvard to reckon with what's unfolding in Sudan, how we can bring minds together to share knowledge, but also how we can use Harvard's platform and spotlight to elevate the story of Sudan and Sudanese voices. So for those of you who've walked across the square, we now have 2 news crews that are reporting on Harvard in the headlines today. I think it's fitting that we're using this occasion to also amplify and elevate the crisis in Sudan, and also recognize the promise of Sudanese people, the potential for humanitarian relief, and the incredible challenges that face the region as a whole if the conflict continues. So with that, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with 3 incredible friends and colleagues in person, and an inspiring NGO leader from our remote connection in Washington, D.C. I wanted to start with you, Mai, or Dr. Hassan. Can you just do a little bit of setup? I think, you and I have been in conversation for many years, and we've had the opportunity to do kind of euphoric analysis of the revolution that was a nonviolent people's protest from 2018 to 2019 that overthrew Sudan's kind of strongest strongman, Omar al-Bashir. And now we're having a very different conversation on a dark and gloomy day when the world feels like it's changed quite a lot. Can you just give us a bit of a 30,000-foot introduction? Like, how did we get here? How did we get from this massive nonviolent people's protest to achieve democracy, transitional government, pacted agreement with regional support, to what feels like a war without end?
Thank you, Zoe, for having me, for putting on this forum to the Institute of Politics. As you said, this is an awful crisis, and just not enough light has been shed on it. So, it's an understatement to say Sudan is in crisis, that Sudan's under fire. 150,000 people have died in this conflict. More than 10 million have been displaced, and another 10 million are facing dire levels of hunger or starvation in Sudan internally. And as you were saying, what's awful about the situation, not only the actual empirics of it, but that it comes on the heels of a euphoric popular revolution that overthrew a despised Islamist regime, the regime of Omar Hassan al-Bashir, who was in power from 1989 until 2019. And so going back to this revolution is necessary to understand how we got here. And so back in 2018, protests started bubbling up across the periphery in Sudan, finally making their way to Khartoum, the capital city, a mega city of 10 million people. Protests continued and finally snowballed until they were so large that the security apparatus in Sudan, which beforehand had been very fragmented, Omar al-Bashir had been in power for 30 years and had not faced a coup attempt. Why? Because he fragmented his security apparatus, made lots of different parallel institutions so that they could all counterbalance each other. In case one, tried to coup him out, there would be another one to stop it. But popular mobilization was so large, was so strong, that the armed forces actually all did get together in 2019 and made him step down. And between April and August of 2019, there was civilians and different elements of the armed forces were working together to construct a constitutional transitional framework, which was supposed to shepherd Sudan back to electoral politics, back to democracy. During this transitional period, there were two main actors. There was civil society, peaceful, popular protest leaders, leaders of different opposition parties. And there were also leaders of different arms of the security apparatus. Sudan, at the same time, had been continuously reeling from other civil conflicts in the periphery, so it was decided that the military would take the reins over the first part of the transition to sign peace agreements with all of the other rebel groups in the country before handing power over to the civilians so that they could shepherd the country towards democracy for the second half of the transition. But then when it came time for that switch, Abdul al-Burhan, who was the leader of the Sudan armed forces, decided that he actually really liked being in power and engaged in a self-coup of sorts, sidelined the civilian elements, and pretty much stayed put. From that point on, it pretty much became a ticking time bomb when Sudan was going to launch into some kind of civil conflict. Because the armed forces, we shouldn't think of them as one unitary actor. Yes, they came together to overthrow Bashir, but they all actually have very different interests. And aside from Burhan, the leader of the Sudan armed forces, the next most important person was Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or nicknamed Hemeti, who was in charge of the rapid support forces. And so once it became clear that the civilians had been sidelined, there was a huge power struggle between the leader of the RSF and the leader of the SAF about different elements of integrating RSF, which was a paramilitary force, into the larger army, into civil military relations more broadly. At some point, actually on April 15th, 2023, it came to a head. Both these sides had been on track to sign an agreement that would absorb the RSF into the Sudan armed forces. But clearly that didn't happen. And then from there, it's unclear who started the conflict, if SAF struck first or RSF struck first. I think most records believe that SAF struck first. And since that moment, when they struck out right outside of Khartoum, the country has been in war. And what's different about this conflict from some of the other ones is, as will become clear in the conversation, but what started out as a war between two belligerents, between two arms of the country's security apparatus, it's metastasized such that different warlords, different rebel group leaders, different Islamist leaders who have their own battalions, who have their own armed forces behind them, have started taking sides. And so what started as a conflict between two arms of the security apparatus has truly become another civil war, with many different groups lining up between each one of the belligerents.
Thanks, Mai. I think that's actually a perfect bridge to then also talk a bit about the fragmentation of alliances in the geopolitical arena around Sudan. So I don't know if, David, maybe you want to start with that, of kind of what is the supportive structure that has led to such what's the supportive structure that's led to such strong military oppositions, right?
The professor's done a brilliant job in explaining some of the history. I think that the link point is the following. The absence of engagement in a time of relative peace, the absence of engagement in support of the civilian government is as great as the presence of engagement on the competing sides since the war broke out in April 2023. And the constellation of forces supporting each side, it was interesting to hear you say that each side is now a coalition. It's not as simple as a unified SAF and a unified rapid support force, both of which came out of the Sudanese army, armed forces. It's constellations on each side. And United Arab Emirates, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, Iran, Egypt, they're all in there supporting different sides. And they're supporting them sufficiently that both sides think that they can win and that there's no reason to stop. And that essentially has fueled the conflict of unspeakable venom for the last 2 years. I think there's a couple of other points that are really important. Let's not forget our geography. Sudan is in a very important place, 45 million people in a very critical part of the world, strategically very, very important. Secondly, the Sudan civil war isn't contained within Sudan. I mean, the fact that there are, I think, 1 million refugees in South Sudan, that's where I was last year. There's now 1 million refugees in South Sudan, 750,000 refugees in Chad. Maybe an equal number have gone into Egypt. In total, 3.5 million refugees beyond. An Economist report last summer said that 60% of the people in Calais trying to get to the UK were from Sudan. I don't think it's that high a number now, but this unspeakable conflict is not being contained within Sudan. One other point, just as the scale of engagement on each side provides a really stark contrast with the lack of support for the civilian government, the lack of engagement in support of the Sudanese civilian government that was described by the professor, the international peacemaking effort has been incredibly fragmented, weak, I think Thabo Mbeki says incoherent. And that has, if you like, at best enabled and at worst supported the metastasizing conflict that the professor has described. I only look at this from a sort of ground level view because the International Rescue Committee, as it happens, we re-established ourselves. We were expelled by the Bashar regime in 2008-9. We went back in 2016-17. We're now working on both sides of the conflict lines with quite a large program, actually a sort of $40 million program in the country trying to make a difference. We've not lost any of our own people, but we'll come on to some of the humanitarian dimensions of this. But this is rightly described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. But it's also, in some ways, the deepest humanitarian crisis because you've got 5 different parts of the country on the verge or in famine conditions. And famine conditions are judged by an extremely small c conservative international phase classification system that doesn't throw the word famine around easily.
Yeah, thanks, David. And in fact, we have one of the world's leading experts on famine in Alex. So
I almost think I was setting him up.
I know. You would be surprised how little coordination it takes to achieve this level of coherence, and if only that was possible in the international response to a massive war. Yeah. So Alex, can you scope out some of the sort of scientific facts of the humanitarian crisis and also maybe speak to the regional dynamics?
So let me speak to the scale of this crisis, because it's a crisis without parallel in terms of the sheer numbers of people. And we don't know how many have died. And we won't for quite some time. But actually, that's not really the metric. The metric that I think we need to understand about this crisis is that it is a crisis of despair. It's a crisis of the collapse of a way of life. It is the disruption, the tearing apart of communities, the people's loss of everything that allows them to have a dignified livelihood on land that is their own in respectful relationship with others. And there are winners in this. All famines are, in contemporary times, are the outcome of a man-made, gendered language, very deliberate. Because they are asset transfers, they are exercises in looting, in accumulating assets, in exerting control over population. So even though the country as a whole may be getting poorer, there are some people who are winning. And it is going to take a lot of effort not only to begin to restore what has been, but also to overcome that trauma and the indignity, the humiliation of starvation. But I also want to make another point. I remember being in this forum 20 years ago, speaking with Samantha Power, who was then an independent activist. She then went on to become head of USAID and had other roles. On Darfur, and there was standing room only. There was a really vibrant movement on this campus and on other campuses saying, save Darfur, never again to genocide. So what's happened to that passion, that commitment? And the celebrities who were so active then, they're all silent now. But also what's happened to the international engagement that was actually preceded the Save Darfur movement, but was also invigorated by it. Because the former President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa was just been quoted. He was the key person appointed by the African Union to oversee a complex series of negotiations leading to the independence of South Sudan and other related activities. And I was on his staff. And I spent essentially 4 years of my life engaged in Sudan. And what was striking was the amount of care and attention that was needed by the African Union, by the United Nations. I think you were Foreign Secretary at the time. It must have been on your desk routinely. It was certainly also on the desk of President Bush, President Obama here. And we didn't get everything right. But there was a recognition that without that attention to keeping peace processes on track, without attention to fostering civil society, creating the space where this ever-vibrant Sudanese civil society could flourish, without attention to the deep economic crisis in which the country was descending, the ship of state would explode. And what was really shocking, as you mentioned, when that opportunity came, something that all the activists, all the Western governments had all been dreaming of, a perfect, beautiful, non-violent revolution, where was the UN? Where was the African Union? Where was the US administration saying, okay, we'll give you debt relief, we'll take you off state sponsor of terror list, we'll give you a chance for this democracy to succeed? No, none of that. Sudan was put in the hands of some frankly incompetent diplomats with the UN and the AU and handed over to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, and to Israel. And Israel said, okay, you signed the Abraham Accords, then we'll intervene with the Trump administration and get you off the state sponsor of terror list. Democracy was thereby given just a tiny chance, which it never was able to take. And I will quote from President Mbeki's his letter. He said, the world has failed Sudan through its paralysis, inaction, and in some cases, complicity in aggravating the violence. So it's pretty strong words from a former head of state. And then he goes on, Sudanese who invested their hopes in the multilateral system, meaning the United Nations and the African Union, with its long record of engagement of Sudan, where it had 4 peacekeeping missions there, have been bitterly disappointed and disturbed by its inability to muster credible leadership and leverage, and to make its norms and peacemaking capacities count. It's just Sudan has simply been abandoned when there was an opportunity for hope, and abandoned still further when it plunged into crisis. And frankly, the Biden administration did next to nothing. This is not an African problem. It's a problem in the African continent where we will see the key actors outside the African continent. But what the UN Secretary General did and what the Biden administration did was they said, okay, let the Africans handle this. We don't want to be bothered, which was a recipe for doing nothing. And we are seeing that unfolding now.
Thanks, Alex. Dr. Hamid, I hope that you've been able to follow the conversation. I wanted to turn it to you to talk a little bit about what it's been like as a sort of development expert someone who's been in leadership in the UN, but in the sort of service side, if you will, leading UNICEF in Zambia and Sierra Leone, having that global perspective and watching what's been unfolding, would you be able to give us both the inside perspective from Sudan and then also the outside perspective from the incredibly talented and widely dispersed Sudanese diaspora?
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you are hearing me.
You sound great.
Okay, thank you very much. And a big thank you for the University of Harvard and for all the participants for the compassion that you are showing for Sudan. Actually, I want to raise some major issues. First of all, this is not the first war that we have in Sudan. We have the first civil war started in August 1955. And it continued for almost 40 years. Thank you for Alex Diwal. I think you contributed to the final agreement of that also. And at the same time, from my own region, South Kordofan, the civil war started in 1984 by Abdulaziz Al-Hilu, who was my classmate in the middle school and in University of Khartoum. And now he's in his late 60s, and he has been fighting for 40 years. And also the war in the Blue Nile started the same time from 85 until now. And in Darfur from 2003 until now. So war is really, we need to go a bit deeper to understand the root causes of this repeated pattern of wars. The war that happened 2 years back was not unexpected. It was expected. And I recall, and this is, I think, something that is still missing. Nobody is looking at the root causes of this war. And so I remember when I was a governor in South Kordofan and part of a national committee on the weapons that is outside the military establishment or the security sector, we had 50 million pieces of weapon outside the government, the official government. So that also shows the kind of issue that we have. 50 million pieces. In my region alone, we have about 5 million pieces of weapons. And that is also not to mention the major issue of the imbalance that is happening in Sudan. And I recall also in the region, and probably this applies for many regions in Sudan, Darfur, Kordofan, and some of the East, almost 80% of the children at the school age are out of the school. And those are who are now manning the wars in Sudan, to the extent that it has become well known that people, they say, اللي عنده كلاش يعيش بلاش. If you have Kalashnikov, I think it's a Russian weapon, you can live for free. That really shows, that is the saying. So this is point number one. Number two, the 30 years when the Islamic Party came to power through a military coup in Sudan against a civilian democratic government, that marked the first fanatic party, Muslim fanatic group that comes to run the power, to hold the power of a state. It never happened before. Especially I'm talking about the Sunni Muslims. So that regime is in this 50 years, it doesn't, ideologically, they don't believe in a professional army. And they always record that in the old history of Islam, during the early days of the 7th century, there was no professional army. It depends all on the mobilization. People are farmers, herders, when there is a need, you give them the weapons and go. That is not a coincidence. They chose from the tribal groups who are all through the history of Sudan, from the first military rule in 1958 in Sudan, they used the militia. The militia is part and parcel of the power structure of the Sudan government, especially during the military regimes. And when they established the Janjaweed, it was to eliminate the revolution of the Darfurians. And also, the same thing was used in the civil war in Sudan. And finally, when the regime started to crack and they have their internal conflicts among themselves, they established the Rapid Support Forces. Fully supported, even they brought the law to the parliament, their own parliament. They approved it, and it became part and parcel of the army. They have their salaries from the army, their training from the Ministry of Finance, and also everything. It's a government institution. And the leader, who is called Hemeti, is like a nickname of everyone who is called Mohammed or Ahmed, just kind of sweet thing of saying it, making it small. This is a Sudanese culture. When they did that, actually, the late President al-Bashir was calling him Hemaiti. And you see the rhyme, Hemeti and Hemaiti. Hemaiti means my own protection, because he was not very much confident of his own army, because now the Islamic team started to crack from inside. So he wanted to protect himself from the other competitors in the system. Let me say, I mean, being part of, in the last year and a half, I mean, after the revolution, I was leaving the UN and to become a governor. I understood exactly, I mean, the last 10 years of the regime of al-Bashir, the regime started to crack down. As it started to crack down, and he feels his grip is losing, is getting a bit loose, he established this to empower himself against his competitors from all the Islamic Party and the Islamic grouping. They made it very powerful to the extent that to prevent any military coup from them. So under that background, the Rapid Support Forces came to power. Now I want to come to your question. Why the revolution and the transitional government did not continue, did not survive? Actually, honestly, the overthrow of the government was made possible also by the youth. I'm not kind of reducing the value of their contribution, but also the internal conflict helped that revolution. And the strategy was actually at least to realize this revolution for a year or so, and then bring the system back under the militant party. Under the militant party, well, I mean, they also give it another name, the National Congress Party. It's just like to decorate it and to present it. So this is why the revolution actually, it was already, when it was born, it was actually established to go in a way that is destined to it. It was not destined to succeed at all, because they are holding everything, not only the funding, but even the parallel civil society also, very strong. So that is, and they engage the tribes. You know, when you go to the community, even the tribal groups are controlled by the government. I mean, that is an amazingly very rigorous and detailed regime. And that is, I think, the power where they managed to stay for 30 years. So there was no, I mean, if you ask me clearly why why the civilians did not succeed to take it, there was no chance for them to succeed. Blocks everywhere, financial, and the military companies that are running the economy, actually more than the GDP, is controlled by the military companies. Typical to some of the neighboring countries that are supporting the Sudanese regime, that is what is happening there. I mean, and to be honest, they are replanting the same Egyptian model into Sudan. And that is a regime which is also very much being exploited and by the neighbors. I mean, the issue of the water Nile is there. This is very crucial issue. We are part of the Nile basin countries, so that is having interest of others. As you said, I think in your papers, this is exactly a proxy war. We have it. There are people, I mean, our neighbors are competing over our resources. Everybody has some arms around there. We have every one of these neighbors, they have agents, they are collaborators with them. And to me, this is a typical regional war. If it is not to be contained, it is going to go there as a regional war. And not only the international power, but also these imperial powers. You know, it's so whether it is in the Middle East, and we are part of that. And I don't want to lose the opportunity to say that because of this Middle East, also there is an issue of identity. I mean, everybody who studies, the issue of Sudan, there is a major issue of identity. And that's also, related to this. And whether you are talking about Islamists, whether you are talking about Arabic identity or the African identity. So I think it's really, sometimes when I get frustrated, I just feel, there is an intention. Sometimes it comes to me very clear. Again, this country is suggested by some people to be divided again. This time is not just kind of giving one part its independence, but it is going to be dismantle the whole country, because if you take Darfur is not coherent, and it's not necessarily for a country to be coherent. Diversity is actually the key word as well. But I have no doubt that this country is, because also, when you look at the international response to the crisis in Sudan, there is no response. And I said this actually when I went and I attended the General Assembly a few months ago. I came out with this conclusion. Sudan is going to collapse. It is destined, it is prepared for it to collapse. There is no attention. There is no attention to this country. Now, even probably more than 150,000 people died. For the first time in my life, I saw somebody is slaughtering somebody. And they are reading a Quranic verse to slaughter somebody and this is our tradition when you want to slaughter a sheep or a cow. Somebody, the same citizen, sharing with you all the belief system, the culture, the value, and the conscience. And still the world is discussing in hotels, discussing the issue of Sudan. My dear people, the solution should go power. Unless there is a power stronger than the gun of the army and the RSF, this war will not end. This is a huge country. It's very huge. No army can succeed in controlling this. From Khartoum to Darfur is even more than from Khartoum, is much more distance than from Khartoum to Cairo. The international intervention is amazingly big from the Middle Eastern countries, African countries also. It seems like a big bull is about to fall down, and people are ready with their knives. Everyone wants to cut something from this bull. This is really very, very serious.
Thank you so much.
Now, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid. I think that's a really a powerful testament to some of what we've heard from the other panelists. And I'm going to do a little filler to say that the mics are open. We have 4 microphones. They're here, up, and down. We invite anyone in the audience to ask a question. When you ask a question, please introduce yourself. Feel free to share your name and what program you're studying in or what your affiliation is in the community, and to ensure that your question ends with a question. A couple of things that I wanted to pick up on to thread common themes that we've heard is this idea that the international community is, on the one hand, very absent. I think, David, you put it really powerfully, and some of my own research echoes this, that when there's a nonviolent mass movement that invokes democracy and creates a portal for change, there is no international community mechanism to reinforce that process. Every time we're reinventing what the transition might look like, and every time we put in place some of the same actors who were complicit in upholding dictatorship. Alex has also worked on this, Mai as well, on the political economy of authoritarianism, of conflict in Sudan and also elsewhere. But then there's this omnipresence of international intervention in perpetuating the war that Dr. Hamid just spoke to so powerfully. Additionally, I want to interject to say that an observer who might be here out of curiosity but without a deep connection to Sudan may be mistaken in thinking that this is some sort of pathology of Sudan and Sudanese people, that Sudan is fully to blame for this. And I think I'd like to push against that narrative, because Sudanese people have also created these alternative futures, these possibilities for creativity, for not just community building, but for incredible businesses, intellectual work, a global impact, as we see from Dr. Hamid's presence here, as we see from Mai and others. And there's always an alternative, right? And that's the one that has been kind of pushed to the very thinnest margins in the past 2 years. So with that, I'd like to invite some of our audience members to direct the rest of our conversation, and if we have the opportunity for a closing question, you all know what it will be. Let's start here.
Hi, thank you all for coming and speaking with us. My name is Wyeth. I'm a first year at the college, and I was wondering, you guys have spoken beautifully and terribly as to what the conflict looks like and how long it's been going on, and how there hasn't been enough international attention around it. So I was wondering, what would need to happen for the international community to rally around this? What could anybody do to help address it?
Thanks, Wyeth.
I mean, it's the right question to ask. First of all, you've got to stop things getting worse. So stop the slide is very, very important, and that starts with, I always say, humanitarian aid is the first step on the road to development. Unless you can stop things getting worse, unless you stop the bleeding, we're going to lose more people. And every bloodshed leads to further danger. Secondly, that will only happen if there's massive pressure on the supporters of each side. And it's interesting that in this conversation, no one's really mentioned the United States, no one's really mentioned China, there's a bit of mention of Russia on the side. The middle powers are big powers when it comes to Sudan, and they're backing each side. They all have links to the superpowers. Those links have got to be used to exercise leverage. Thirdly, you've heard a lot about civilians. Until the civilian representatives come back into the political equation, it's very hard to see how the country is held together, never mind put together. And that takes, fourthly, a political process, not just a political answer. I think there's a danger of a political answer being imposed from outside. There has to be a process to engage those who are on the inside. And that's absolutely key. I mean, it's much easier said than done. But in the Thabo Mbeki letter to the London conference, he says there is no military solution. The danger is that this becomes a cliche that is not actually followed, even though it's true. Yeah. And there isn't actually victory for either side, but there will be no cease until there is a political process and a political endgame. We should have learned that by now.
And just to put a point on the London conference, ministers from over a dozen countries are invited, none from Sudan, right? So this is sort of what we're referring to. Let's come to this mic next.
Hi, thank you guys so much for coming. This is such an important topic, and I'm so glad you were able to share your experiences with us. My name is Ben. I'm a freshman at the college. And my question is, like, you know, kind of adding on to Wyatt's question, do you guys think, what steps can we take right here, or people like us, students, people in the Harvard community, to actually make a change, like one or two quick steps, or maybe not quick, but yeah,
Thanks,
anything along
Ben.
those lines.
Alex.
One very specific suggestion, which is the humanitarian actors on the ground are Sudanese, and there's a specific form that Sudanese civic humanitarian action has taken. It's called the emergency response rooms. And they are not only the most effective way of assisting people, they are also the foundation stone for future civic action and democracy, and they can be supported. And I'm sure Mai can tell us how they could be supported.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with Alex that if we're thinking about how to support the humanitarian situation in Sudan, the emergency response rooms are definitely the way to go. And there's a lot of organizations that are collecting money from the states and then sending it directly to those rooms. And they're giving out meals, giving out healthcare. Another thing, though, is to call our senators, to call our representatives. And I think Sudan is not on the international agenda, in part because there's no domestic constituency that's pushing for their powerful country to make it important to them. And so starting a campaign, calling your senator, writing letters, and those such things.
Can I just add to that? I mean, the emergency response rooms are what we sponsored right at the beginning of the conflict. They're absolutely key. But remember this, there's a threat to the Sudanese who are here at the moment. Sudanese students, Sudanese refugees, the refugee resettlement has been stopped. That whole part of the American contribution to the equation, which is at a very human level, that's important as well.
Thank you. Let's come to this side, and then this mic will be next.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm Mohammed. I'm a second year MPA student at the Kennedy School. I'm Sudanese. And I mean, I guess a couple things. So one with regards to engaging with Sudan. I mean, Sudan is represented at the United Nations and other international organizations by one side, right? Despite, the Burhan Saf side having, done the self-coup, the legitimacy in these large international organizations remain. And so the position of Sudan it's kind of moot in these organizations. So I guess the question would be how do we kind of move to a more realistic or a more kind of just paradigm, recognizing that these folks are a group of militias here. The SAF is a bunch of militias, and so is the others, right? And secondly, with respect to the civilians, in terms of political engagement, political development, South side has been kind of changing up the constitution, giving additional political powers to their group. On the other side, there is this kind of there's a founding charter by this group called Ta'sis. I mean, I'm a firm believer in distrust but verify, but it's an interesting sort of counterbalance of kind of secularism to the Islamism that's on the other side, and this kind of federal government program, and they have lots and lots, they're not short of civilian interlocutors, right? So the question there would be, okay, how do you bring in those civilian voices? Neither of the armed groups are really legitimate, but how do you empower the civilian interlocutors who have some leverage with these groups?
Great question.
I'll ask, I think,
Yeah, Dr. Hamid, do you want to comment on that one, perhaps? Dr. Hamid, if you can hear us, you're muted.
Yeah, I think these are all very good suggestions. I would add to them, actually, there should be a major movement, very wide-scale movement to demand ceasefire. because the ceasefire will enable the people in the countryside to cultivate their farms, to go after their livestock, and gradually to kind of fight the war. Without the ceasefire, it will continue. I mean, I assure you that the two parties are not ready. Actually, the two parties and their supporters, or their supporters and the agents. They're I don't want to say masters, but I mean the people behind them. Let me put it in a kind way. So unless people really make this ceasefire, things will not be improved. Secondly, the humanitarian intervention. Also, that is to make peaceful routes into the country. Now, for example, after the taking of Khartoum, overtaking Khartoum and some of the central states in Jazeera, now they started to receive some humanitarian aid from international organizations, maybe less than 50% of the demand, but the rest of the country is not receiving anything because of the fact that there is active war, and in most of these also there is no schooling. The currency has been changed to deny them access to cash, and then also they have to deny them access to identity. I mean, it is really kind of by design. I mean, they are working on really separating the country, particularly. So I think mobilizing the civilians, and I believe strongly in American politicians can be engaged in really making a push towards this, and this should also be from other big countries in the European Union and others to really intervene, to really put a pressure on this. The third thing, I think, let me be very frank here. This war is also, proxy war between the neighbors and in the Middle East. Unless we identify these neighbors and try to influence them, because they are. This is a prey. They are competing of a prey. Sudan is. It's very very colonial perspective on the country, or very imperial kind of thing. Sudan is extremely rich. I can say it's the richest African country. We have 149 million livestock. This is the second largest grazing country after Australia. We have, this is an amazingly rich country, but it was never in peace, not in itself, not with the neighbors, especially during the rule of the Congress Party, National Congress Party, and the Islamists. So I think all this, and also people need to expose this issue, to write about it, even in international journals, international media, etc., so that we can really try to push on the two fighting parties.
Thank you so
very
much, Dr. Hamid. I'm going to take two more questions, and then I'm going to give this panel one last chance at any of these three questions, right? The one that we've just heard, and then the next two. So if the two interlocutors on this, do you want to just both ask your question one after the other at the mic? You'll get the last two questions, and then I'll give the panel the last word.
Sounds good. Hi, my name is Dinan. I'm also Sudanese. I'm a senior at the college. First off, I really appreciated this. On a personal note, I just feel like people haven't been talking about Sudan at all, and it's felt very helpless considering every Sudanese person I know has been very deeply impacted. That being said, I had a hopefully simple question on whether or not this is actually a civil war. It feels wrong to call it that, because when I tell people, they're like, oh, it's a civil war, you guys should figure it out. But then you guys have spoken a lot about the role of other countries and this being a proxy war, perhaps. And so it just feels sometimes a little unfair to call it a civil war, and I was hoping to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And I just wanted to very briefly mention, I am also Sudanese. My name is Zainab Bakhit. I'm at the law school. There are those of us already here at Harvard who are fundraising on behalf of the emergency response rooms. We've raised almost $50,000 and we're working directly with the leadership. So if you're interested, please come and talk to me. And my question is a very practical one, but right now there is a horrific massacre occurring in Darfur that has kept me up at night. Like, I literally have not slept in days. And there's been a shocking silence around the world, and especially here in the West. And I'm just curious, you know, Darfur was the first genocide of the 21st century, and it has just remained. So if you have any practical guidance for us on campuses, but also just as a, international community that is concerned about Sudan, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. And I'll give the panelists the last word. Maybe we'll just work our way down.
Very briefly, to your question, this phenomenon of internationalized civil conflict is actually typical of the modern world, not atypical. And I think it's really important to see that. Whether you think about Sudan, whether you think about Yemen, you can look around. There are 59 conflicts around the world. Very few of them are pure civil conflicts. And in that sense, the Sudan conflict speaks to a wider global phenomenon, and one where hard power is in the ascendant and diplomacy is in retreat. And the tools of diplomacy are not being used, but they're in retreat. And I think that's why you're right to call it a civil war suggests it's been incubated only within the country. That's not the right way of thinking about it. Sadly, it's far from the only case.
So I think these comments are all highly relevant. And I wish there were simple answers, and there are no simple answers. I think the next step, and we haven't had a readout from what happened in London today, but the next step will have to include several different things. One is there will have to be an alignment among those Middle Eastern powers. They are too far in, they are too powerful, they cannot be squeezed out of the picture. Without them, there can be no solution, but they cannot solve it. And then there has to be a peace process, and there is a huge vacuum into which the multilaterals, the UN, the Arab League, the African Union can step. But I think the civilians in Sudan did one extraordinary thing which has prevailed throughout this, which is that the card of legitimacy is held by the civilians. Nobody can claim to be a legitimate government without the blessing of the civilians. And even those belligerents recognize that. And I want to just make one point about the recognition of the government of Sudan, which was, I think, a mistake by the UN. I think it was one of the UN's several mistakes. And one of the things the African Union has done right is not to recognize them. The Arab League also has not recognized them. But they also made a very interesting move which opens up a new possibility, which is they brought a genocide case at the International Court of Justice against the UAE. Now, if the court decides that it has jurisdiction on the case, Sudan is bound by the Genocide Convention. So that is a sword with two blades. And what I would very much hope is that the ICJ can hold the government of Sudan and all other players to that convention and issue provisional orders in the way that the court did just over a year ago for Israel on humanitarian issues. Can say, we cannot, as a court, sit idly by and see this mass starvation to unfold. And in the case of Israel, even the Israeli judge on the court voted in favor of that, making it unanimous. And so that's a precedent for actually bringing the World Court, the highest authority, which the government of Sudan has reached out to, and making that court relevant to the realities in Sudan.
May.
One of the comments that I wanted to pick up on was this idea that there's this disconnect, Mohammed, I believe it was your question, between the governments in power representing Sudan, whether it's at the UN or Ta'sis, creating this new parallel government by the blessing of Nairobi, and actual civilians on the ground. And I think, as Alex said, the trump card in Sudan is that civil society can be highly mobilized. We've had 3 popular revolutions to oust 3 military dictatorships. That's incredible. And I think I'm hopeful that civil society will be mobilized again in some fashion to help bring some kind of legitimacy to whatever new state, or when there is a peaceful resolution that comes about. I think it's going to involve a lot of popular mobilization. The difficulty, though, is that in part because of this 30-year Islamist regime that shot down all of civil society, there's no real leaders, civilian leaders that have legitimacy and broad appeal. Yes, we have the emergency response rooms, but they are all working on their own little communities, in their own little neighborhoods, in their own cities. They're trying to aggregate up and create a system that says that they represent all of Sudan, but that's still slowly coming. A lot of the politicians that were involved in opposition parties, a lot of them have been discredited. They have a really hard time speaking for all of Sudan. And so I think one of the challenges is going to be not so much the popular mobilization. I think civil society can mobilize again. I think the difficulty is going to be finding legitimate civilian leaders that have the power and the backing of the Sudanese people behind them.
Thank you all so much. One of the great tragedies of war is that it infects all of the goodwill that is available and latent in the country. And I really urge everyone to look at the Thabo Mbeki report on what Sudanese civil society demands today. It's available on the anniversary. And with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, thanking Dr. Hamid, and thanking all of you for being here this evening.